So it is the middle of October, y'all. And the 21st week after Pentecost. And I think it's interesting, what is that phrase that the days move, that they say about kids, like the days move slowly and the years move. What is it? I don't remember that phrase exactly, about how the time kind of moves both slow and fast at the same time. And I think particularly right now where we're doing this hybrid service, this COVID but not COVID time, right? We're going out to dinner, we're doing the things we do, but we're still trying to protect one another. It is moving both slow and fast concurrently, right? We're getting back to normal-ish, whatever that means. And as a parent, this text kind of struck me particularly, but I say parent, and I don't think you have to be a parent to recognize the jealousy in this text. Some of us as teachers or managers or friends, we tell people that they're our favorites sometimes to assure them that they are loved. And as a chaplain, I would walk into folks' rooms and say, how's my favorite patient doing? I would do that in every room. So Jesus wasn't a parent. He had no children. Though in Matthew, he compared himself and God to a mother hen. He was a teacher. The disciples, the other 10 besides James and John in this particular text, were experiencing extreme jealousy in their relationship to him. And some would argue ultimately that that's what Judas's undoing was all about. Jealousy, envy of others' relationships. That betrayal with a kiss, but that was about envy of relationships. I don't know about y'all, how many, don't raise your hands, but none of us ever experienced jealousy, right? Of a part, of a relationship, of a closeness, of intimacy with another. And in my 2 consecutive years being a chaplain resident, on the many days doing rounds, walking into each and every room, not traumas. Whether folks were 9 or 109, because I did have one person that was 108, saying, how's my favorite patient? You would see a light flicker on. And I didn't care how sick those folks were. You would see a light flicker on in these sick folks. Even little pediatric people, when you would say, how's my favorite patient doing? Now, does that really mean that they were my favorite patient? Yes, each and every one of them for that 5 minutes or hour long that I sat with them, they were the only person in that hospital. In the book of John, the beloved disciple and Peter seemed to have some rivalry. So jealousy isn't a one and done thing in these gospels. Just combine gospel and hospital, but there's something going on there, right? There's even some jealousy happening between the disciples and Mary Magdalene. We know this, right? Jesus's point is to make certain that all understand that they are what? Loved, beloved in the sight of God. And there's a reason, right? It's so that it transcends that moment. I'm going to tell you about a particular patient of mine, and we don't tell HIPAA information, so some of these details are a little bit different. There is this patient encounter of mine that sticks with me. I even wake up dreaming of him sometimes. And I don't know if any of you have people in your lives that you've encountered that stick with you. Gail, I don't know if you have kids that you wonder where they still are, if they're still alive, what they're doing. They stick with you. And you have folks that you just wonder how they are doing. if they're still alive, coworkers that struggled and got their life together, and you just wonder how they're doing. People in theater that, I don't know, they could get their act together for a show, but I don't know. You wonder.
You gave them for 2 months, and then when the show's over, you don't see them for a year. You wonder.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So Justin was a patient of mine, chronic heroin user that came into my renal unit. He had overdosed countless times, not just on heroin, he would use any drug. He had multiple organ failures at the point that I met him. He had teenage children that were the only reason he could think of for living, but they were estranged, so why bother, right? Justin at around 6 feet tall, he was probably more than that, but in a bed, he looked small. He weighed around 130 pounds, he had bruises all over his body, and he was yellow from jaundice. He was originally disinclined to speak to me, so much so that barely able to walk, he left the room the first time I showed up at 130 pounds, jaundice, bruised, and a heroin user. I stayed, and most of the time, this was kind of at the juncture of us changing our dress code. I couldn't show tattoos, and I didn't have the one on my hands. So I would wear tights and either sweaters or a jacket, so you wouldn't ever see that I had any tattoos. But he left, and I knew he wouldn't go very far because he had a bracelet on and he couldn't just leave the unit. So I took off my sweater and I just sat in the corner knowing he would come back. He shows back up, and of course, I didn't have a mask or anything on. It was pre-COVID. So I'm sitting in a corner, and he sees me sitting there with tattoos, and he's like, "Oh God, thank God that chaplain lady left." Climbs back in bed, and he says, "Oh, they sent a chaplain here," and I said, "Oh, did they?" So that was rude. And I said, "Well, why would they do that?" And he starts to tell me his story. So he tells me his story. Midway through it, I say, "Hey, Justin," and he says, "What?" And I said, "Well, I'm the chaplain." And I put my sweater back on and as my badge. And he drops a couple expletives. And then we get to know each other fairly well. He was on the unit for nearly 3 months. And as Justin shared his story, I shared a little bit of my own. And I rarely disclose my story to my patients. Even in pastoral care, I find it best that they focus on their own story and their past and their path forward. But through small self-disclosures of my own, the tattoos were my in with him. It usually works with addicts, homeless folks, people just out of prison. The collar sometimes pushes people away. Justin shared his own childhood trauma and that he felt that he didn't deserve to live or to be a father to his own children. During the course of his first week and our first week together, we were able to write an I am statement, which I did with a lot of my other patients. On that white medical board that they have, they have your statistics, your blood pressure, they have what medications you're on, your height, your weight, if you're NPO, if you can't eat, whatever. We wrote, "I am beloved." And I made him say it as I left the room. A few days later, I show back up and he changed it to "I am loved," which reminds me of those Hellsberg buttons that they give you. But it worked for him more so than "I am beloved." And he felt that that fit he wouldn't have used theology, but theology and language better. And every time I left the room, I said, "Justin, what are you?" He said, "I am loved." And over the course of days and weeks and times together, I would see Justin. He was either the first or the last patient that I saw every single day. I wanted to make sure I laid eyes on him every single day. Because bruised and battered and 130 pounds was not a good place to be. I wanted to see a change. I wanted to see him. And I would see him looking more, well, less like death and more like life. I would see him around the halls of the hospital, walking in his walker throughout the hospital, and he would shout out to me, "Hey, chaplain, I'm loved and so are you." And I didn't encourage that. Eventually, he just would, it didn't matter where he was, because the bracelet would allow him to gain more access to the hospital. And it became our thing. About a month into medical treatment, Justin had medically detoxed enough that he was able to go to 12-step meetings at the hospital. A few weeks after that, his care team and I developed a plan to contact his ex-wife about reuniting with his children. He made the call, and I was in the room with the social worker, and all parties agreed to a supervised visit at the hospital. There was not a dry eye in the room. He held it together till the phone call ended, and then he wept pretty openly. There was snot running down his face, and we all had tissues. It was a beautiful experience. His two teenage daughters came for a visit around Valentine's Day. That was pretty amazing. The I am love statement, and they show up around Valentine's Day. I'm not sure if it was exactly on Valentine's Day, but it was certainly that week, because there were Valentine's decorations all over the hospital. Shortly after his visit, he was transferred to a long-term rehab center and received an email that he was doing well, other than needing dialysis, but still in contact with both daughters. He eventually needed a kidney transplant, and a family member stepped up and donated a kidney. He couldn't receive one because of all the drug use from regular transplant lists. So friends, that's what love can do. But it had accountability. He had stopped using, he had to go to 12% program, he needed to take care of his body. Justin had some things he needed to do to hold up his end of the deal, to see his daughters being highly favored. Ugh. So Jesus asked something of us. Now, Mark's gospel shows us this emphasis on the beauty and dignity of servanthood. And it forms the context from which we can understand what Jesus means when he says that the child of humanity came to give his life as a ransom for many. This phrase is frequently interpreted as supporting ways of understanding the cross as a kind of ransom payment to the devil or to God. Ugh, that's not where we're going today. In order to secure humanity's salvation. But here, Jesus mentions no such need and no such pay. This isn't a transactional sort of thing. Strange omission that that's actually what's on his mind, right? He doesn't say that. That's how I grew up, right, in my church. He must have some other ideas. So for starters, a ransom is something of value given for the sake of liberating a captive. And in Mark's gospel, Jesus does indeed come as a healer and as a liberator. But what particular ailment, what particular captivity is highlighted here in these chapters? Again and again, these 3 times in a row, is not captivity. It's not captivity to demonic forces. And, you know, we could talk about Justin's case. He's probably got some forces at play here. But it's not to God, right? It's unpayable, this debt to God. On the contrary, it's the disciples' captivity to what? Self-centeredness, or to conventional notions of power, prestige, or supposed greatness. We talked about that last week a little bit. The story of the rich man in this pattern, where he had many possessions. And it helps to fill out the picture of the prison from which Jesus intends to set us free. Following Jesus means liberation from the cell of our own self-absorption, opening us up to God and neighbor and humility, generosity and love, which is to offer and say that opening us up to true servanthood is what Mark underlines and underscores in Mark 8-10. The dignity of servanthood is nothing less than this section's organizing theme. So the phrase "to give his life as ransom for many" is sort of a poetic way of saying pour out his life in servanthood to humanity, even in the face of fierce opposition, which we face today, right? And so it wants to show us the way and liberate us into living us. The incarnate Son of God gives something of value, his life, for the sake of our freedom. Our learning to follow him along the way of being a servant of all with humility, generosity, love, and grace. And we will probably be talking about how to do that at our property meeting. How do we free ourselves from transactional ways of doing ministry and do that with dignity, humility, and grace? For Justin, he was liberating himself from his own forces of addiction and learning a new kind of love. For many of us, we are learning a new kind of currency outside of capitalism, where we are serving our neighbors and being set free from the ways that empire has held us captive. So my kids, when they were little, would always say that being favored or favorite is hard work. When your mom's favorite, she puts you to work. Loving ourselves and being loved enough to see ourselves through God's eyes, and then to see each other through God's eyes, to be servants no matter what. Can we do that, right? Can we still serve those we know that we have hurt? And it's really funny because I wrote this sermon before Beth and I attended the Salt and Light conference yesterday. And I wrote this sermon on Tuesday, or when, I don't even know, the week kind of just blended. I don't know how your weeks go, but I don't know what day, what happened other than yesterday. But I had questions in the sermon. Can we still serve those people that we know that we have hurt or been complicit in hurting? You know, I can't say that I have personally hurt Indigenous people on purpose, right? But I have ultimately been complicit in hurting Black and Brown Indigenous people. And then I went to the Salt and Light conference, and I went to a whole seminar on breaking bread on stolen land. And you can punch in where your zip code is or where your church stands and find out whose land we stole to get it. We being kind of this loose term, right? And so I have questions in here. Can we still serve those people that we have hurt? And we being this loose term, right? And then I have the Indigenous people who we have hurt with our policies, who might be angry with us. Question mark. Where we stand in our churches, where we sit in our beds at home or our recliners. The Black folks who might be angry with us, the LGBTQ folks who may have been hurt by our churches and our congregations. How do we plan services for folks we haven't met yet? How do we invite people in who may not understand that we're not that kind of church? How do we not be defensive and show up with love when we may be met with anger? How do we accept that we may not have all the answers, and yet God will lead us anyway? How do we get our hands dirty, knowing that God will wash us clean doing this beautiful work? How do we go where Jesus beckons us back to a table to break bread again and again and again with people that are hurting? and not just on Sundays. I think we have a property meeting. And I think we have a Trans Day of Remembrance service. And I think that yesterday, again, this is off script, we talked about the women in Cana that asked Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus said to her, I thought the Canaanites were all dead. Even the dogs get scratched. And what did he do? He healed her and her daughter and gave them more than scraps. And if Jesus can learn in that moment that there were still Canaanites, I feel like I have a whole lot of learning left to do. It is hard, loving, dirty, healing work, this gospel work. And there are so many folks that need to hear the good news that we have yet to meet, and who we can learn from, who Jesus was willing to learn from, who look like Jesus. Amen.